This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen as he explains intellectual property and the scenarios in which it can impact farms, taxes, and advancements. Jason Warner, K-State Extension cow-calf specialist, contributes to the show by discussing feed tags and what information should be found and evaluated. Part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Dustin Pendell, and Bob Larson ends today's show as they talk through imports and exports of beef. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show hearing from K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Shelby.
And Roger, discussing a recent blog article from yourself, and within this article, you describe this topic as the silent engine of the modern farm. So what are we talking about today?
Well, we're talking about intellectual property. And indeed, I think the entire ag landscape has been undergoing a digital and biological revolution. We could wrap into this drought-resistant hybrids, proprietary algorithms for precision planting, or big data that's harvested by a fleet of autonomous combines. But this intellectual property issue is, as you say, the silent engine of the modern farm.
And so while we're thinking about this and maybe thinking about research and development tax deductions, what has changed or per se returned to the market?
Well, I think from a legal and tax perspective, intellectual property or IP is often misunderstood. And for many producers, it really leads to missed tax deductions or even worse, unintended tax hits when it's time to sell. And so there are things that farmers and ranchers need to know. And I'm going to start with, I think where we should start is with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and particularly with respect to the change in the rules with respect to the deductibility of research and development costs. And what we have now is full expensing is back. And that's a change in the rule. We used to have that, and then TCJA changed that and said, no, you got to spread your R&D costs over 5 years. But now OBA brings it back. So for years starting after 2024, you get to fully deduct domestic R&D costs in the year you spend the money. Now, there's a special catch-up relief rule that's in there, and that gets pretty technical. So if you had unamortized costs from the years that were in limbo, basically because of OBA, that would be 22, 23, and 24, there is a way to claim those deductions now. But this applies to domestic R&D. So if you're sourcing your tech from overseas, you're still stuck with a 15-year wait to fully deduct those costs. But documentation is going to be the key. And we just had a recent tax court case on this, Shelby. And what that case tells us is that if you're going to qualify for the R&D tax credit, your research and experimentation expenditures have to be rooted in hard sciences. That means biology, chemistry, or engineering, and they must involve a process of experimentation that's intended to eliminate uncertainty. So if you're testing a custom software interface for your equipment or a new biological soil amendment, you want to keep records of your failures because the court wants to see the scientific process, not just the final result. And that's just one area of what could be missed tax deductions based on something associated with intellectual property.
And what are some other examples you see of intellectual property that would qualify for this tax deduction?
With the advent of bioengineered seeds, we've got intellectual property rights associated with seed. And farmers will often ask me about the right to save seed. And whether they have that right or not actually depends on the legal shield that protects the plant. And so if that plant is protected by the Plant Variety Protection Act, you can save some seed. It's a limited right. But commonly we'll see that with respect to traditional varieties, and you can save seed to plant on your own acreage. If the seeds are protected by a general utility patent, then you cannot save the seed. And so most of our modern traded seeds that have traits that are resistant to various types of herbicide, those would be covered by utility patents. You cannot save those seeds. And in fact, when you buy that seed, you have to sign a technology agreement saying that you will not save it, and you get prosecuted. And the companies do protect their intellectual property rights pretty closely in that type of seed.
For someone who's maybe looking at the seed of the Plant Variety Protection Act, and you mentioned it being planted on your own acreage, is that them needing to own that acreage if they're wanting to do this, or could they be leasing it?
Well, you could plant it on acreage that you own and acreage that you farm. So a tenant can save the seed to plant on their acreage that they're farming or on their own acreage. But it goes either way, but you just can't go beyond that. And so that's acreage that you basically think of it as acreage that you operate. And you don't want to expand that out unless you have increased your ownership or usage of that property, because the companies will monitor the farms that you are operating at the FSA office, and they'll see if your acreage hasn't gone up, but you're not buying, or let's say your acreage has gone up, but you're not buying more seed. That's an indication that you might be skirting some of the protections on those seeds. So be very careful with that. There are some punitive damage awards that can be awarded in these types of situations. You just want to stay away from those things.
And while we're talking about taxes and intellectual property, is there a long-term capital gain treatment that some people might also qualify for?
Yeah, if you invent a new tool or a plant variety and you sell the patent, you might qualify for long-term capital gain treatment. That means a lower tax rate, but it's a pretty narrow gate. This only applies to individuals. So if you do it through your corporation, a C corporation or an S corp, you're not going to be able to access that fast track to capital gains. Plus, there's a related party trap. If you sell your patent to a family-owned entity where you own 25% or more of that entity, you lose the tax advantage. And so the IRS is basically saying, well, you're selling to yourself. You shouldn't get a tax break on that.
How would someone show that maybe it is an individual just doing this work of maybe inventing a new plant variety?
Well, as long as you don't have some type of entity that's been created and on file with the state, which makes it very easy to check, because if you file a corporation, partnership, and LLC, you have to file some type of certificate of existence. Then you're operating as an individual, plus they're going to look at your tax returns. And so if you're reporting that on individual schedule rather than some type of corporate return, that's going to bolster your position that you did not create an entity and you are qualified for the long-term capital gain treatment as an individual.
And something maybe not super tangible, but important for farmers to also keep in mind, what you termed the invisible asset, and what is this?
Yeah, this can come into play when you sell a farm and or when you buy a farm. Who owns the yield maps? Who owns the soil health records? Is it the landowner? Is it the tenant? Is it the equipment manufacturer? Well, we know that ag data is increasingly being treated under the law like a trade secret. So if you buy a farm, the data that comes with it is an intangible asset that you could usually write off or amortize that cost of that data over 15 years. Now, if you create the data, you can't write off the value of that. So you can't write off the value of your own data, but it still has immense value to you during a sale. So what I'm saying here is don't rely on handshake deals for digital assets. Ensure your lease or purchase agreements include a data use agreement to clarify who owns that digital footprint associated with that land.
While we're thinking about the year of 2026, what are things that you recommend people keep in mind?
I'd say do an audit of your R&D. You may not have ever thought about this or done this before, but separate out your routine production costs from your experimentation costs to maximize your deductions under the new tax law. Maybe that's an issue for you, maybe it's not, but maybe it's something you need to think about. And then if you're developing intellectual property, talk to a professional in that area before you incorporate, because once you move your intellectual property into a corporation, that can sometimes lock your tax benefits away from you. And then formalize your data ownership, whether you're a landlord, whether you're a tenant. Who owns the yield? Define who owns the yield in the soil data in writing. Put that in writing. So my whole point on all of this, Shelby, is that intellectual property is not just for Silicon Valley anymore. It's a farm gate issue. And so if you stay ahead of these legal shifts, you're going to protect the future of your operation.
And Roger, you mentioned that if someone's maybe wanting to develop some intellectual property, talking to a professional in that area, and is that professional going to be an intellectual property lawyer, or what terms might be used to describe professionals in that industry?
No, that's a good question. It could indeed include somebody that is trained in intellectual property law, but also here you have a lot of tax concepts. So your tax professional should be able to advise you with respect to the transfer, the purchase, the sale of and development of intellectual property, particularly when we're talking about R&D costs and intellectual property associated with a farm sale or farm acquisition. So your tax professional, intellectual property attorney. And sometimes it'll depend on the exact type of intellectual property that's involved. But this is something that decades earlier we have not talked about. But this is the technological advance, and it does impact tax and law.
So as we look forward for intellectual property, what do you think you might see?
Well, what we see, I think, is across the board with respect to crops, with respect to livestock, with respect to soil. There's all types of intellectual property that's developed in all areas of farming and ranching. It's not just one aspect. And so when a farm is bought or sold, when research and experimentation costs are incurred to develop some new technology, that all has important tax and legal implications to it. Farming's not as easy as it used to be.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. If you'd like to read more on this topic, I will link his blog article titled Navigating Intellectual Property on the Modern Farm in today's show notes on agtoday.net. You can also find it by going to agmanager.info. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Warner. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing feed labeling with K-State Extension Cow-Calf Specialist Jason Warner. Jason, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome, Shelby. Appreciate the opportunity to be on, as always.
And Jason, as we will have a little bit more of a cattle focus during this conversation, feed labeling, something really important for all species. And what are some feed regulations and guidelines?
This is a topic that I think is a really good one to think about, and it's really something that I don't think a lot of us on a daily basis, really spend much time, really thinking about the importance of feed labeling and, why feed labels and tags are put together the way that they are and the information that they have on it. And it's something that's really, I think, kind of easy to be overlooked. But it's really, really critical when you think about the importance of safeguarding feed manufacturing for animal health and human health, and for protecting our consumers and making sure that producers and consumers have good information in front of them when they come to making these important feed purchasing decisions. And so really, I think it's good for folks to be aware that feed manufacturers follow the guidance of the laws that are put in place at the state level. And those guidelines that are put in place really are developed through the guidance of an additional regulatory body that is out there in the feed manufacturing industry. And that body is called the AFCO, or the Association of American Feed Control Officials. And what that is a body, if you will, that really functions as an independent organization that's made up of individuals from around the feed manufacturing industry that would service all species. And really what the role of that organization is to really have a good standard democratic process for how standards and guidelines that are ultimately adopted by the state departments of commerce or the state departments of agriculture within each respective state. They are the ones who really develop those guidelines that are ultimately followed at the state level, that feed manufacturers then ultimately follow when they're making feed within a certain state. And so I think that's just a really important thing for folks to be aware of, that there is a body out there that is really just there to serve as a good, sound source of information And through their work and through their research, they essentially are the ultimate decision-making body that's agreed upon by members of that organization. And so, they serve to help train regulatory officials. Again, when we think about the importance of protecting ultimately the consumer, safeguarding animal health, those things which are really critical. And it's also important because it helps provide, a level playing field for commerce and for business to be done with. And so that's a really important thing. And so, again, it's called the AFCO. It's the American Association of Feed Control Officials, and it's there to help develop those guidelines that state associations and state laws will ultimately enact. And so I think just something that's important for folks to keep in mind. And so really, when we think about the main areas of a feed tag, if you walk into your feed supplier, that co-op, that retail outlet, and you're purchasing feed, and we're thinking about what we would call floor stock feed or standard commercial feed that's available that anybody can come in and purchase. When we think about that type of feed, that's going to have certain labeling requirements, but it's all going to be really dependent on the type of feed that it is. And that's really the big thing that would drive what the feed labeling requirements are going to look like for that specific tag or for that specific product. And so really when we step back and we take a look at it, I think just some big things we want folks to keep in mind as they think about the main areas of a feed label or a feed tag. So it's required by law that whatever that physical container is that is being purchased by the consumer. So when we think about a 50-pound bag of feed, so it's got to have a label on it that has a certain amount of information that's important for that consumer and has to be presented in a certain way. And again, as we think about the importance of having a regulatory body like that AFCO body that helps decide and come to a general consensus among industry professionals of what information needs to be on that tag, this is where we see it come to fruition for us. So when we think about just the main areas that you want to look for a tag, okay, there's going to be a brand name that feed might be labeled under, and then a specific product name, and then there's going to be a purpose statement. And that's really important that there's going to be a specific purpose statement that's going to be labeled on that tag. And so as an example, if something said, okay, if it was a feed that was labeled as a protein supplement for beef cattle, well, that would be an example of a purpose statement that's on that tag, and the name of the product might be 30% range cube. So we have a specific product name, and then we have a specific statement for the intended purpose of that feed.
Jason, we've talked, I feel like, a lot about bags, but do we also see this when we look at like mineral lick tubs?
Absolutely. So that's a really good question. So you'll see those same types of labels are required to be affixed regardless of the form of the feed. So as we think about, yes, a bag of mineral, or if it's in a tub form, if it's a pressed block or a poured lick tub or a supplement tub like that, or if they're processed, what we call cubes, if they're range cubes that are pressed through a die, or if it's a texturized feed or a mixed feed, right? Regardless of what the physical form of that feed is that might be sold, regardless of whatever that physical form is, it's got to have a label on it, depending on what the smallest quantity of the container is that consumer is ultimately going to purchase. So if it's a 50-pound bag of range cubes, it's got to have a tag on it if it's being sold in a 50-pound quantity. If it's a tub, it's got to have a label on it that's either going to be affixed to the side of the container or to the top part of that tub. So that's a really good question. Regardless of the physical form of the feed, whatever the smallest unit of sale or the smallest container that is sold, that it is put into and that it's sold to the consumer in, it's going to have that label on there. And so a few other things that are really important for consumers and for producers to be thinking about as they look at those tags, the information that's going to have to be required to be on there. So if it's a medicated feed, right? So that specific medication and the dosage that is going to be provided has to be on that label. And then after that, really, as we kind of think about going from the top of the tag down towards the bottom, the general layout is going to be the same that manufacturers will follow. And so really the big thing there, after we get past what the name of the product is and what the specific intended use of that product is, and if there's any medication there, after we get that, we're really looking at a guaranteed nutrient analysis. And this is where it will certainly vary quite a bit depending on what the specific product is. And that's really going to be the big thing that really dictates what the specific nutrients are going to be on that tag. It's going to be dependent of what the specific product is. And then after that, after a nutrient analysis, there'll be a list of ingredients. And all the ingredients that are going to be included into that product have got to be listed on there. And then there'll be feeding directions and name and contact information of the manufacturer. And then ultimately what you will see on that tag, usually the very last thing that's going to be listed there will be a net quantity that will be in that container. So whatever the net quantity is, minus the weight of the container. So whatever the net actual amount of product that is being purchased there is going to be included. And a couple other optional things that you don't always necessarily see on every single feed tag, but sometimes you do, is a lot number and a date of manufacturer that the manufacturer might put on there. And certainly that's helpful from a tracking standpoint. And when you think about feed getting through the distribution channels, going from a manufacturer maybe to a wholesaler and then ultimately to a retail store, having that information on there is certainly very valuable.
While people are looking at these tags, what's sometimes something that commonly just accidentally gets overlooked?
I think the biggest thing that folks always want to keep in mind as they think about their feed manufacturing labels is make really, really close attention or pay really close attention to the drug medications that might be listed in that product, and make sure that you have a good sound understanding of what the feeding directions are relative to the intended use of that product. And I think something that can be really real easily overlooked is just understanding what is the intended use of that product based on the level of medication that might be in that feed. So just make sure that you have a clear understanding of what the label says, what the intended use is, and how much of that product you actually need to be feeding out to make sure that you're feeding that product appropriately. So you're feeding it within the guidelines and what the recommended levels are based on the level of medication that's in there. And again, make sure that you're reaching out to someone if you have questions on that or you need clarity, because that's a really important thing that we want to make sure that we are following to make sure that we're staying within an approved recommended feeding range based on the product and what it's medicated with.
Jason, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
You bet. Absolutely. Thanks.
That was K-State Extension cow-calf specialist Jason Warner. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and I'm Colton Tripp for Shelby Varner. We continue the show with part of a Cattle Chat podcast episode from the Beef Cattle Institute with Brad White, Dustin Pendell, and Bob Larson, discussing the importance of imports and exports of beef in the U.S. market.
So I guess the first thing is maybe just taking a step back before we talk about kind of the current situation. We export beef anywhere from 10 to 15%, but yet we import 10 to 15, maybe a little more. And so people are probably asking, well, why do we that? I think, when you say, beef, well, yes, it is beef, but there's different products, right? You got over 200 different products of an animal, and what we export is much different than what we import the products, right? So when we export, we will export, high value products to various countries, maybe Asian countries like Japan, like tongues, for example, or short ribs to maybe South Korea, but then an offal to maybe the Middle East, livers, stuff that we don't consume here. Otherwise, if we didn't consume it, if we didn't export it, we probably would have to pay money to put it into a landfill, which we've talked about demand on previous podcasts. And I'm saying that relates back to that discussion. But what do we import? Well, we import a very specific product, right? It's mostly lean product that we can ground in with our hamburger, or we can make hamburger. Yeah. We import and export two different things, and generally it's from different countries, right? When we import, we talk about Australia, New Zealand, and some South American countries like Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay.
Pretty different industry and how they grow beef in those areas.
Right. And so when we think about Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, I mean, that's not necessarily grain-fed, right? We're talking grass-fed, and so it's going to be a lot leaner. And so we're importing that lean beef to mix with our trimmings that have a lot more fat to get the perfect blend for...
Yeah, it seems, when you think about beef consumption in the United States, the first thing that comes to my mind are steaks and hamburgers. And then to some extent roasts and some other things too. But I don't think of liver. I don't think of tripe. I don't think of other cuts. And it's what you're saying is a lot of those things that I'm not thinking of, we export those because a lot of people aren't thinking of those in the United States. But when you think about hamburger, and particularly, the last few years, we've really increased the weight and the percent fat on finished cattle. And that fat really only has value if I can mix it with lean and turn it into a 80-20 or 70-30 hamburger. And so it kind of makes sense to me that we've needed to bring in some lean because we are creating more fat than we did 10 years ago.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just thinking about the more recent situation, which is what one thing Brad asked about, is we're actually down total beef production in 25, and actually since 2022 we've been down total beef production, not by a lot but by a little bit. And yes, the numbers have been going down. We've talked about that on previous podcasts, but where those numbers are really coming from, it's the cull cows. We're down since 2022, we're down almost 25% in terms of beef production. So I think the cull cows is where that loss of production is coming from,
because we may not have started growing, but we're not continuing to cull at the same rate because the herd is small.
Right. And now we're probably going to continue to...
If we keep heifers back, then we're going to continue to be pressured there.
And so we have been importing a lot of beef in terms of, our largest countries have been Australia. We're up 250% since 2022 from Australia. Canada's our second. Brazil's number 3. Mexico is 4, but it's actually down because of got the border closed since last May, July. New Zealand, and then Uruguay. And then more recently, there's been a lot of political discussion surrounding this, right? And so Argentina gets brought into the mix. We have imported in January of 2026. I think we imported a bunch more from Argentina, but they're still not going to make their quota, and so we'll still probably import from other countries. But in general, there's a big difference between imports and exports, and the reason we do both is because it's two different products.
That was an excerpt from the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Dustin Pendell, and Bob Larson. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we will be back with more for you tomorrow.